The emergency call center stopped feeling like a normal workplace long before the city officially collapsed. By the third night of the outbreak, the building had become something closer to a bunker, filled with exhausted voices, flickering monitors, and non-stop screaming echoing through phone headsets 24 hours a day. The dispatcher had worked overnight shifts for nearly 4 years, handling everything from traffic accidents to house fires, but nothing prepared him for the chaos spreading outside now. Every incoming line flashed red constantly. Thousands of emergency calls flooded the system faster than operators could answer them. Some callers screamed about violent attacks in apartment buildings. Others whispered from locked bathrooms, while strange noises echoed outside their doors. Entire hospitals stopped responding one after another, while police frequencies dissolved into panic-filled shouting before cutting into static forever. At first, the government called the situation a containment emergency caused by riots and mass hysteria, but everyone inside the dispatch center already knew something far worse was happening. Too many callers described the same horrifying details. People attacking strangers without reason, victims continuing to move after fatal injuries, entire neighborhoods going silent overnight. By sunset on the second day, smoke covered most of the skyline beyond the dispatch center windows, while helicopters circled endlessly above the city carrying military personnel toward evacuation zones no civilian could reach anymore. Nobody inside the call center had gone home since the outbreak began. Operators slept in break rooms when exhaustion became unbearable, surviving on vending machine snacks, cold coffee and adrenaline while trying to keep emergency lines functioning. The dispatcher sat surrounded by glowing monitors and endless incoming calls for nearly 14 hours straight during the third overnight shift. His eyes burned from staring at screens. His hands shook constantly from too much caffeine and lack of sleep. Yet every time he considered taking a short break, another desperate voice came through the headset, begging for help that probably would never arrive. Around 1:40 a.m., the power grid across the city partially failed. Half the monitors inside the center flickered off briefly, before backup generators activated with a deep mechanical hum shaking the building. Emergency lights switched on overhead, bathing the room in dim orange light, while operators continued answering calls through the darkness. Outside the tall dispatch center windows, large sections of the city had already gone completely black, except for distant fires glowing between buildings beneath drifting smoke. That was when the strange call first appeared. The dispatcher almost ignored it, because the system labeled the incoming number as corrupted data. Normally disconnected calls displayed error codes automatically, especially after communication towers started failing across the city earlier that evening. But this line somehow pushed through anyway. Static crackled loudly through the headset before a weak male voice suddenly whispered, "Please, please send someone." The dispatcher immediately straightened in his chair. The voice sounded terrified, exhausted. "Emergency services," he answered automatically, while typing into the system. "What's your location?" For several seconds only heavy breathing came through the line. Then, the caller whispered an address, quietly enough that the dispatcher almost missed it beneath the static. His hands froze over the keyboard immediately after hearing it. He recognized the location instantly, because everyone in the dispatch center spent most of the previous day monitoring evacuation failures there. The address belonged to an apartment district inside Grayford City, nearly 30 miles east. Except Grayford no longer existed anymore. 2 days earlier, military bombings destroyed most of the city, after evacuation zones collapsed completely. Emergency broadcast confirmed the area was overrun beyond containment. Every surviving resident was either evacuated or presumed dead. Communication lines throughout Grayford had been destroyed during the bombings. The dispatcher stared at the screen in confusion, while the terrified caller continued breathing heavily through the static. "Sir," the dispatcher said carefully, "that district was evacuated." "No," the caller whispered immediately. "No, they're still here." Something banged loudly somewhere in the background of the call, causing the man to panic instantly. "Please hurry," he whispered desperately. "They keep scratching inside the walls." The dispatcher felt cold suddenly despite the warmth inside the overcrowded emergency center. Nearby operators continued answering desperate calls while alarms and ringing phones filled the room. Yet the voice inside his headset sounded strangely isolated from all of it, almost distant. "Who's scratching?" he asked quietly. Another loud sound echoed through the caller's apartment. Slow scraping, then silence. The man lowered his voice even further afterward. "They only move after midnight." Static briefly overwhelmed the line before the dispatcher could respond. He quickly checked Grayford's emergency grid again on another monitor, hoping the system data was wrong somehow. But every communication tower across the city still displayed completely offline. Satellite reports listed the entire district as destroyed beyond recovery. Fires were supposedly still burning there. Nobody should have been alive inside Grayford. "Sir," the dispatcher asked carefully, "how are you calling this line?" The caller didn't answer immediately. Instead, the dispatcher heard something else through the headset, whispering. Multiple voices moving faintly beneath the static interference. At first it sounded like radio distortion, until the dispatcher realized the whispers almost resembled people speaking softly somewhere inside the apartment with the caller. "Can you hear them too?" the man suddenly asked. Every hair along the dispatcher's arm stood up instantly. "Hear who?" Another loud scraping noise echoed behind the caller, closer this time. Then came a terrible sound like fingernails dragging slowly across concrete inside the walls themselves. The caller began breathing faster. "Please," he whispered desperately. "Don't put me back on hold." The dispatcher immediately muted surrounding calls and focused completely on the strange line. "Stay calm," he said. "Tell me exactly what's happening there." But before the caller could answer, every monitor inside the dispatch center suddenly flickered again. The backup lights dimmed momentarily, while static exploded violently through the headset, loud enough to make the dispatcher pull it away from his ear. Then the caller screamed, not loudly, worse, a terrified whisper filled with absolute panic. "They know I'm awake." The line immediately died afterward. Silence replaced the call except for faint, static hissing through the headset. The dispatcher stared at the disconnected screen for several long seconds, while his heartbeat pounded violently in his chest. Around him, operators continued working frantically beneath flickering emergency lights, completely unaware something deeply wrong had just happened. One nearby employee complained about strange interference spreading through multiple emergency channels, while another mentioned receiving blank calls from disconnected districts all night. The dispatcher slowly replayed the recorded call through the system archives, hoping he imagined parts of it from exhaustion. But the recording only made the situation worse. Beneath the caller's frightened breathing and static interference, faint whispers truly existed in the background audio, not random noise. Voices, multiple layered voices speaking too softly to understand clearly. Then the dispatcher noticed something even stranger. According to the system timestamp, the call didn't route through active communication towers at all. The incoming signal originated from underground emergency relay lines beneath Grayford City. Lines officially destroyed during the military bombings 2 days earlier. A cold feeling settled deep in the dispatcher's stomach, while emergency sirens echoed faintly somewhere outside beyond the dark city skyline. Then suddenly his monitor flashed again. The same corrupted number had started calling back. The corrupted number kept flashing across the dispatcher's monitor long after he stopped believing the first call could be explained logically. Around him, the emergency call center continued drowning beneath non-stop panic, while operators shouted across rows of glowing monitors, trying to keep up with collapsing communication systems throughout the city. But none of that felt real anymore compared to the blinking red line repeatedly reconnecting on his screen. Each time the system tried identifying the incoming signal, The location data corrupted instantly before displaying the same impossible result again. Grayford City Underground Relay Network. The dispatcher finally answered the call after the third reconnect attempt. Static burst through the headset, immediately followed by weak breathing somewhere in the darkness beyond the line. For several seconds neither side spoke. Then the terrified male voice returned exactly as before. "You answered again," the caller whispered softly. The dispatcher glanced toward nearby operators to make sure nobody else overheard the conversation. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. "My name's Daniel," the caller replied after a pause. "Please tell me help is coming." The dispatcher didn't know how to answer that anymore. Through the tall windows of the emergency center, large sections of the city outside had already gone dark, while distant fires glowed beneath heavy smoke drifting across the skyline. Police frequencies barely functioned now. Entire hospital systems stopped responding nearly an hour earlier. Emergency units dispatched into infected districts rarely answered follow-up calls afterward. Nobody was going to Grayford. Everyone knew that. "Daniel," the dispatcher said carefully. "Grayford was evacuated 2 days ago." Silence followed. Then faint whispering crackled through the line again beneath the static. This time the dispatcher could almost distinguish words hidden inside the interference. Soft voices repeating things too distorted to fully understand. Daniel lowered his own voice immediately afterward. "That's what they keep saying too." The dispatcher felt cold again. "Who?" Something scraped loudly somewhere in the background of the call, causing Daniel to inhale sharply. "The people inside the walls." The dispatcher nearly removed the headset again after hearing that. Nearby operators continued shouting emergency codes across the center, while alarms flashed on overhead monitors. Yet Daniel's terrified whisper somehow felt more disturbing than all the chaos surrounding him. "There shouldn't be anyone else there," the dispatcher said quietly. Daniel laughed weakly under his breath. Not amusement, exhaustion. "I thought that too," another sound echoed behind him. Slow tapping, like fingernails against metal pipe somewhere deep inside the apartment walls. Daniel's breathing became uneven immediately. They started moving after the power died. The dispatcher quickly typed notes into the system while recording everything automatically. "How long have you been trapped there?" "I don't know anymore." Daniel paused several seconds before continuing. The clock stopped matching. Before the dispatcher could ask what that meant, another operator nearby suddenly shouted for technical assistance. Multiple disconnected phone lines throughout the center had begun activating by themselves. Several headsets emitted loud static bursts despite receiving no incoming calls at all. One exhausted employee ripped off her headphones, claiming she heard someone whispering her name through a disconnected emergency line. The dispatcher barely noticed because Daniel suddenly whispered something far worse into the headset. "They know when people fall asleep." Every noise inside the call center seemed distant for a moment after hearing those words. "What do you mean?" the dispatcher asked slowly. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, the dispatcher heard faint movement through the phone, like someone carefully shifting furniture across the apartment floor. Then came another scraping noise inside the walls, closer now. "At first, Daniel," whispered shakily. "It was just sounds at night." His voice trembled harder with every sentence. "People scratching inside the building, whispering in empty rooms." But after the military bombings, static swallowed part of his next words. The people who slept stopped waking up normally. The dispatcher's hands froze over the keyboard again. Normally, Daniel inhaled slowly. Some woke up standing outside. A loud bang interrupted him somewhere deeper in the apartment, followed by several seconds of absolute silence. The dispatcher immediately leaned forward. "Daniel?" Another soft scraping sound moved through the walls. Then came whispering. Not through the phone this time. Real whispering echoing faintly behind Daniel somewhere inside the apartment. Multiple voices speaking softly together. "They're awake again," Daniel breathed. The dispatcher felt genuine fear for the first time since the outbreak began. "Listen carefully," he said quickly. "You need to get out of that building immediately." And Daniel gave a weak laugh again. "There's nowhere outside anymore." Then the line suddenly distorted violently. Static exploded through the headset mixed with dozens of overlapping whispers, layered together like multiple people speaking simultaneously through deep water. Among the interference, one sentence emerged clearly enough to understand. "Stay on the line." The dispatcher ripped the headset slightly away from his ear in shock. "Daniel?" Silence followed, then the call disconnected completely again. The dispatcher immediately tried tracing the incoming signal through the system network, despite knowing it shouldn't exist. According to archived infrastructure maps, Greyford's underground emergency relay systems were built decades earlier beneath the city during Cold War expansion projects. Most of the underground switchboards connected through maintenance tunnels and emergency communication bunkers buried beneath major districts, but all of it supposedly lost power after the military bombings. Yet somehow Daniel's calls still routed through those dead systems perfectly. A nearby operator named Melissa suddenly stood up from her desk looking pale and confused. "Did somebody transfer me a call?" she asked shakily. Nobody answered her. Melissa slowly removed her headset while staring toward the floor. "I just heard someone breathing on a disconnected line." Several operators ignored her entirely because strange technical issues had become constant throughout the night. But the dispatcher noticed something unsettling. Melissa looked exhausted beyond normal sleep deprivation. Dark circles surrounded her eyes. Her movement seemed slower somehow. Then she quietly added something worse. They kept asking if the tunnels were still open. Before anyone could question her further, every monitor inside the emergency center flickered simultaneously. Backup generators groaned loudly beneath the floor, while the overhead lights dimmed to deep orange emergency power again. Outside the windows, another large section of the city lost electricity completely. Darkness spread block by block across the skyline, while distant sirens echoed through empty streets far below. The dispatcher looked back toward his monitor just as the corrupted number flashed across the screen again. "Incoming call, unknown relay source." His stomach tightened instantly. He answered without hesitation this time. Daniel sounded weaker than before, more exhausted. "I tried sleeping earlier," he whispered. "Don't do that," the dispatcher said immediately. "What happened?" For several seconds only breathing came through the line. Then Daniel whispered something that made the dispatcher's blood run cold. "I woke up somewhere underground." Silence filled the headset afterward except for distant dripping water echoing behind him. Not apartment sounds anymore, tunnels. The dispatcher sat upright instantly. "Daniel, where are you now?" "I don't know." More dripping echoed through the phone, followed by faint electrical buzzing somewhere far away. "There are phones ringing down here." The dispatcher's chest tightened. "How did you get underground?" Daniel answered softly like someone describing a dream. "I followed the voices." Then somewhere behind him, deep within the tunnels, hundreds of phones suddenly began ringing at the exact same time. The sound of hundreds of phones ringing through Daniel's call continued echoing inside the dispatcher's headset long after the line itself disconnected. The noise wasn't normal ringing either. It sounded distorted somehow, layered unevenly through underground tunnels, with faint echoes repeating seconds too late, like the sound itself was moving through enormous empty spaces beneath the city. When the call finally died completely, the dispatcher remained frozen at his desk, staring at the dead monitor, while cold static hissed softly through his headset. Around him, the emergency center continued collapsing into chaos. Several operators argued with supervisors near the back offices, while emergency alarms flashed across half-functioning monitors. More communication districts had just gone offline across the city. Police frequencies barely worked anymore, except for occasional gunfire and screaming breaking through the static before vanishing again. But inside the dispatcher's mind, only one detail mattered now. Daniel had somehow reached underground relay tunnels beneath a city that officially no longer existed. Nearby, Melissa suddenly removed her headset again with shaking hands. The disconnected lines are still active," she whispered nervously. Nobody responded immediately because several other operators were experiencing the same thing now. Phones connected to abandoned districts continued receiving incoming calls. Despite those networks being destroyed hours earlier, some headsets emitted breathing sounds from empty lines. Others played faint whispers beneath the static. One exhausted employee swore she heard emergency sirens echoing through her disconnected receiver, even though the line wasn't connected to anything at all. The dispatcher opened archived infrastructure files across his monitor while trying to ignore the panic spreading through the room. Old city maps revealed dozens of forgotten emergency relay stations buried beneath Grayford during Cold War construction decades earlier. Massive underground communication tunnels connected government shelters, hospitals, dispatch systems, and military bunkers beneath the city streets. Most of the network was abandoned years ago after newer wireless systems replaced them. According to official reports, military bombings destroyed the surface districts 2 days earlier, but nobody had ever confirmed what happened underground. "You're still looking into those calls?" a tired voice asked beside him. The dispatcher turned and saw Howard, one of the older technical engineers responsible for maintaining the dispatch center systems. Howard looked terrible. His gray uniform hung loosely from his exhausted body, while deep red veins filled his sleepless eyes. He had apparently been working non-stop since the outbreak began, repairing communication failures throughout the building. The dispatcher quietly explained Daniel's calls and the underground relay traces appearing in the system. Howard listened silently while staring toward the monitor. Then his expression slowly darkened. "Those tunnels shouldn't still have power," he muttered, "unless backup relays activated automatically." The dispatcher frowned. "Could someone survive down there?" Howard hesitated before answering. "Maybe for a while." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. Some of the underground switch stations were built like fallout shelters, water systems, emergency generators, independent communication grids. The dispatcher immediately thought about Daniel, hearing hundreds of phones ringing underground. "Has anyone checked those tunnels since the bombings?" Howard slowly shook his head. "Nobody goes into Grayford anymore." Before the dispatcher could continue questioning him, a loud crash echoed from the far side of the emergency center. Everyone turned instantly. One operator had collapsed unconscious beside her desk after apparently falling asleep during shift. Several employees rushed toward her, while supervisors shouted for medical assistance. But when security guards tried waking her, something deeply disturbing happened. The unconscious operator suddenly sat upright on her own before anyone touched her. Her eyes opened slowly, completely unfocused. Then she quietly asked, "Are the phones still ringing downstairs?" Silence spread through the dispatch center immediately after hearing that. The woman looked genuinely confused by everyone staring at her. She had no memory of collapsing or speaking at all. Howard backed away from her with visible fear before whispering something the dispatcher almost didn't hear. "It's spreading through the lines now." Nobody slept after that. Not willingly. Operators forced themselves awake, using cold water, energy drinks, caffeine pills, anything strong enough to keep their eyes open another hour. But exhaustion already hung over the building like poison. Some employees stared blankly at monitors without blinking much anymore. Others jumped violently whenever disconnected phones emitted bursts of static nearby. Around 3:15 a.m., every unused phone inside the emergency center suddenly activated simultaneously. Not ringing, breathing. Low, distorted breathing echoed through dozens of disconnected headsets at once. Several operators ripped their headphones off immediately in panic, while others froze completely. Then the whispering started. Soft voices emerged beneath the breathing from every inactive line in the building. Some voices sounded male, others female. A few sounded frighteningly familiar. One operator burst into tears after hearing her missing daughter's voice whispering through a dead receiver. Another employee stood motionless beside his desk, listening to something nobody else could hear, before slowly reaching toward an inactive phone line. Howard immediately disconnected the entire unused switchboard system from the wall, causing the voices to cut off abruptly. Silence returned to the emergency center, except for the hum of backup generators beneath the floor. Nobody spoke for several long seconds afterward. Then the dispatcher's monitor flashed again. Incoming call, unknown relay source. His pulse immediately spiked. He answered before anyone else noticed. Daniel sounded different this time, more distant somehow. "You shouldn't keep answering," he whispered softly. The dispatcher quickly muted nearby channels and leaned closer to the headset. "Daniel, where are you?" Faint dripping water echoed through the call again alongside low electrical buzzing. "Still underground." His breathing sounded uneven, like he had been running recently. "I found the old dispatch tunnels," the dispatcher typed quickly while recording everything. "Are you alone?" Daniel paused too long before answering. "I don't think so anymore." Somewhere far behind him, faint phones continued ringing through the darkness. "There are people down here," he whispered. "Operators." The dispatcher's chest tightened. "Survivors?" Daniel laughed weakly again. "Maybe once." Static briefly swallowed part of the line before his voice returned shakier than before. "They sit at the old switchboards, answering phones that aren't connected." The dispatcher felt genuine dread spreading through him now. "Daniel, listen carefully. You need to leave those tunnels immediately." Another long silence followed. Then Daniel whispered something terrifying. "They told me you'd say that." The dispatcher froze completely. "Who told you?" Suddenly another voice spoke through the headset. "Not Daniel." A calm female whisper layered beneath the static. "Emergency services are still active." The dispatcher nearly ripped the headset off again. "Who is this?" No answer came immediately. Then multiple voices began overlapping through the line together. Soft, calm, repeating the same sentence in unison. "Please remain on the line." The dispatcher's entire body went cold. Somewhere across the emergency center, several disconnected phones started ringing again by themselves. Operators backed away from their desks in fear, while security guards shouted confused orders across the room. But the dispatcher barely heard any of it, because Daniel suddenly returned to the line, whispering frantically now. "They know where the calls are going." Loud footsteps echoed somewhere behind him through the underground tunnels, followed by the sound of metal doors opening slowly. Daniel's breathing became panicked. "I think they found me." The dispatcher stood up from his desk instinctively. "Daniel, get out of there now." Then, through the headset, the dispatcher heard something impossible. Emergency dispatch operators speaking scripted responses in perfect calm voices, somewhere deep underground. Hundreds of them. "What is your emergency? Please stay calm. Units are being dispatched." The voices repeated endlessly through the tunnels beneath Grayford City, while Daniel ran somewhere through the darkness. And then suddenly one final voice spoke clearly through the noise. A voice identical to the dispatcher's own. "Don't let them answer the calls." By 4 a.m. the emergency call center no longer felt stable enough to survive another hour. Backup generators groaned constantly beneath the building, while sections of the city outside disappeared into darkness, one district at a time. Fires burned across distant streets beyond the dispatch center windows, casting orange light through thick smoke drifting between silent skyscrapers. Most emergency services had completely collapsed now. Police frequencies transmitted only fragmented gunfire and desperate screams before dissolving into static. Hospitals stopped accepting incoming calls nearly an hour earlier. Several operators inside the dispatch center had already abandoned their stations entirely after the disconnected phone lines began whispering familiar voices through dead receivers. The remaining employees looked barely functional from exhaustion and fear. Nobody trusted the phones anymore. Yet the calls from Grayford continued. The dispatcher sat alone near the back communication terminals, replaying Daniel's latest transmission repeatedly through his headset, while Howard worked nearby disconnecting corrupted relay channels from the main emergency network. Every playback revealed more disturbing details hidden beneath the static. The underground tunnel acoustics, the ringing phones echoing through impossible distances beneath the city, and worst of all, the voices calmly answering emergency calls somewhere underground, even though Grayford officially contained no surviving communication staff anymore. Howard finally stopped working and stared toward the dispatcher with hollow, exhausted eyes. "You need to stop listening to those calls," he muttered quietly. "Why?" the dispatcher asked immediately. Howard hesitated before answering. "Because people exposed to those frequencies too long start hearing things even after the line disconnects." The dispatcher almost dismissed the warning until he noticed Howard's hands shaking violently while adjusting cables beside the switchboards. "You've heard them too," the dispatcher said slowly. Howard looked away toward the darkened windows. 3 nights ago. Silence settled briefly between them, while distant alarms echoed through the failing dispatch center. Then Howard leaned closer, lowering his voice carefully. At first it sounded like normal interference, voices buried under static. Then the calls started mentioning things nobody else could know. The dispatcher felt cold again. "Like what?" Howard swallowed hard. "My wife." He rubbed trembling hands against his exhausted face before continuing. "She died 6 years ago." Before the dispatcher could respond, every monitor across the communication floor flickered simultaneously. Backup lights dimmed. Static burst loudly through dozens of inactive headsets across the room. Then the phones began ringing again. Not incoming emergency lines, dead phones. Disconnected receivers throughout the building, activated by themselves. Their ringing echoing unnaturally through the darkened dispatch center. Several exhausted operators backed away immediately, while one security guard started unplugging equipment from the walls in panic. But the ringing only spread farther across the room. Howard stared toward the inactive switchboards with growing horror. "It's using the backup relays now," he whispered. Then suddenly one phone near the dispatcher's desk stopped ringing. Its receiver slowly lifted upward on its own before falling sideways against the desk edge. Static hissed softly through the speaker, and then came Daniel's voice. "I found the lower tunnels." The dispatcher grabbed the receiver instantly despite Howard shouting not to touch it. Daniel sounded exhausted beyond human limits now. His breathing trembled heavily through the line while distant emergency alarms echoed somewhere far underground behind him. "Daniel, where are you?" the dispatcher demanded. "Beneath the old relay stations," Daniel whispered weakly. "There are dispatch rooms down here still running." The dispatcher muted surrounding noise and focused entirely on the call. "How is any of it still powered?" For several seconds only static answered him. Then Daniel whispered something worse. "I don't think the power is coming from the city anymore." A loud metallic sound echoed somewhere behind him through the tunnels. Massive doors moving slowly. Daniel immediately lowered his voice further. "They're close again." The dispatcher stood from his desk instinctively. "Who?" Daniel inhaled shakily. "The operators." The emergency center around the dispatcher continued descending into panic while he listened. One exhausted employee near the break room suddenly screamed after hearing voices through a disconnected headset. Another operator collapsed asleep beside her station before security dragged her away from the communication floor entirely. Yet none of it felt as terrifying as Daniel's whispering voice through the dead line. "They don't attack immediately," Daniel continued quietly. "They just keep answering phones." The dispatcher's stomach tightened. "What are you talking about?" Another loud metallic groan echoed through the tunnels behind Daniel, followed by faint ringing somewhere deeper underground. "I found an old emergency dispatch hall," he whispered. Hundreds of operators sitting at switchboards. His breathing became uneven again. Most looked dead. The dispatcher felt genuine nausea rising in his chest. "Daniel, you need to leave now." But Daniel kept speaking like he hadn't heard him. "Their headsets are still connected. Their hands keep moving. Static distorted the next sentence briefly before it returned clearer than before. And the phones never stopped ringing. The dispatcher heard it then, very faint beneath the call. Hundreds of ringing phones echoing through enormous underground chambers somewhere beneath Grayford City. The sound seemed endless. "What are the operators doing?" the dispatcher asked carefully. Daniel answered almost immediately. "Talking to people." The dispatcher froze. "Survivors." Silence filled the line. Several seconds before Daniel whispered, "I don't think they're talking to humans anymore." Suddenly another voice interrupted the call. Calm female, distorted slightly beneath the static. "Emergency services are currently unavailable." Daniel inhaled sharply. "They found me again." The line erupted briefly with movement sounds and hurried footsteps through underground tunnels. Daniel began breathing harder, while distant phones rang louder behind him. "Daniel," the dispatcher shouted, "listen to me. Find an exit and stay awake." But Daniel barely sounded present anymore. The tunnels go deeper than the maps show. Metal doors slammed somewhere behind him. There are more relay rooms below the city. A static crackled violently across the line before his voice returned weaker than ever. "I think the military used these systems during the first outbreaks." The dispatcher typed frantically while recording every word. "What systems?" Then Daniel whispered something that made the dispatcher's blood run cold. "Broadcast frequencies." The lights inside the emergency center suddenly failed completely. Darkness swallowed the room, except for flashing red backup alarms overhead. Operators shouted panic, while disconnected phones throughout the building began ringing louder than before. Howard grabbed the dispatcher's shoulder immediately. "Hang up now." But the dispatcher couldn't move because Daniel was still whispering through the line. "I found something else down here." Faint footsteps echoed behind him, slow, calm, approaching through the tunnels. There are names written on the walls. The dispatcher tightened his grip on the receiver. "What names?" Silence followed briefly. Then Daniel whispered softly, "Yours is here." The dispatcher's heart nearly stopped. Before he could respond, another voice suddenly spoke directly through the headset beside Daniel's breathing. Not distorted this time, clear, calm, human. "Dista 417, the voice said softly. "Please proceed to the lower levels." Every disconnected phone inside the emergency center activated at once immediately afterward. And through the darkness surrounding the dispatcher, dozens of dead receivers began repeating the exact same sentence together. "Please proceed to the lower levels." The moment the disconnected phones throughout the emergency center began repeating, "Please proceed to the lower levels," in perfect unison, panic completely consumed the building. Operators abandoned their desks. Several employees ripped cords directly from the walls, while others backed into corners covering their ears as the voices echoed across the dark communication floor beneath flashing red emergency lights. Yet even after power cables were disconnected, the phones continued speaking anyway, calm, patient, endless. "Dista 417, please proceed to the lower levels." The dispatcher stood frozen beside his desk, gripping Daniel's receiver, while Howard desperately shut down relay systems across nearby terminals. "We have to disconnect the entire switchboard," Howard shouted over the noise. But before anyone could move farther, every phone in the emergency center suddenly went silent at once. The silence felt even worse, no ringing, no voices. Only the low mechanical hum of backup generators beneath the floor and distant sirens echoing somewhere far outside the collapsing city. Then the dispatcher heard breathing through Daniel's line again, weak, uneven, alive. "Daniel?" he whispered immediately. Several seconds passed before Daniel answered. "I think they left." His voice sounded exhausted beyond recognition now, almost numb from fear and sleeplessness. Behind him, the underground tunnels remained strangely quiet except for faint electrical buzzing and dripping water somewhere deep below the city. "Where are you?" the dispatcher asked quickly. Daniel coughed hard before answering. "Near the lower dispatch chambers." The dispatcher exchanged an uneasy glance with Howard, who looked increasingly terrified listening nearby. "What do you mean lower chambers?" Daniel inhaled shakily. There are levels beneath the relay tunnels. He paused briefly. Old emergency communication shelters. Howard immediately grabbed another monitor and opened archived government blueprints with trembling fingers. The dispatcher watched his face slowly lose color while scanning the files. The tunnels connect to Cold War bunkers, Howard whispered quietly. Huge underground communication facilities. He looked toward the dispatcher carefully. Most of them were classified. Daniel continued speaking through the line before either man could process the information fully. The operators down here aren't trapped. The dispatcher frowned. What? Another distant phone rang somewhere behind Daniel through the darkness. They're staying willingly. A cold feeling spread through the dispatcher's chest. Daniel, listen carefully. You need to leave those tunnels immediately. Silence answered him briefly. Then Daniel whispered something deeply unsettling. I tried. Faint footsteps echoed somewhere nearby underground. Slow movement through flooded corridors. The deeper levels keep changing. The dispatcher stared toward the dark emergency center around him, while disconnected monitors flickered weakly beside abandoned desks. Changing how? The tunnels don't match the maps anymore. Daniel's breathing became uneven again. Doors lead to different places every time. Howard slowly backed away from the receiver after hearing that. No, he muttered nervously. That's impossible. But the dispatcher remembered something else now. Several emergency workers earlier in the outbreak reported losing hours of time while navigating underground subway stations and service tunnels beneath infected districts. Most dismissed it as exhaustion or trauma. Now he wasn't so sure anymore. Suddenly Daniel lowered his voice to nearly a whisper. I found the main dispatch room. The dispatcher immediately focused again. What's there? Static crackled softly across the line before Daniel answered. Operators, his voice shook harder now. Hundreds of them. The dispatcher heard faint ringing phones echoing behind him again. Endless overlapping calls through enormous underground spaces. Most are sitting completely still, Daniel whispered. But they keep answering phones. Howard stared toward the receiver in horror. Ask him what they're saying. The dispatcher nodded quickly. Daniel, what are the operators talking about? Several seconds passed before Daniel answered weakly. Emergency calls. The dispatcher frowned in confusion. From who? Silence followed. Then Daniel whispered, people who aren't alive anymore. The emergency center around the dispatcher felt freezing suddenly despite the generator heat. What do you mean? Daniel's breathing quickened again. I heard them taking calls from destroyed cities, dead districts, places nobody survived. Somewhere underground, a woman's calm dispatch voice echoed faintly through the line. Please remain indoors until emergency services arrive. Daniel immediately lowered his voice further afterward. The callers don't know they're dead. Howard turned away from the conversation completely after hearing that. He looked close to panic himself now. Shut the line down, he whispered urgently. Whatever's underground is spreading through the relay network. But before the dispatcher could respond, Daniel suddenly whispered something else. I found the source room. The dispatcher froze. Source room, footsteps echoed behind Daniel again, closer this time. Multiple people moving slowly through flooded tunnels. There's an old military relay chamber below the dispatch halls, Daniel whispered quickly. Massive transmission equipment. Emergency broadcast systems. Static briefly swallowed part of the line. I think the government used these frequencies during the first outbreak to keep people calm. Howard grabbed the receiver suddenly. Daniel, he shouted, listen carefully. Whatever you do, don't answer any phones down there. Silence followed several seconds. Then Daniel spoke softly. I already did. Every light inside the emergency center flickered violently the moment he said that. Static exploded through disconnected speakers across the room, while several dead monitors switched on by themselves, displaying corrupted emergency broadcast screens. Howard slowly released the receiver and backed away in terror. What did you hear? The dispatcher asked carefully. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, the dispatcher heard faint whispering beneath the line again. Hundreds of overlapping voices moving through static like distant crowds speaking underwater. Then Daniel whispered something that made the dispatcher's blood run cold. It knew my name. The phones throughout the emergency center suddenly began ringing again all at once, louder than before. Operators who remained inside the building panicked immediately, while security guards shouted for evacuation. Several disconnected receivers lifted slightly off their cradles from the vibration of the ringing itself. Howard grabbed emergency shutdown keys from a nearby cabinet. "We have to cut the relay systems completely." But the dispatcher barely heard him, because Daniel suddenly started breathing harder through the line. "They're coming back." The footsteps underground had grown much closer now. Calm measured walking through the tunnels. Not running, not rushing. "Who's coming?" the dispatcher whispered. Daniel answered weakly. "The operators." Then another voice interrupted the call. Calm female, perfectly clear. "Deister 417. The dispatcher's entire body went rigid. "Your line is now active." Every disconnected phone inside the emergency center stopped ringing instantly afterward. Then, one by one, the receivers slowly lifted off their cradles by themselves throughout the dark room. Howard stared in horror while dozens of phones across the communication floor activated simultaneously. And through every receiver at once, hundreds of calm voices began speaking together in perfect unison. "What is your emergency?" The sound of hundreds of voices asking, "What is your emergency?" echoed through the dark emergency center from every disconnected phone, at once, while receivers hung crookedly above their cradles across abandoned desks. Some swung slowly back and forth as though invisible hands still held them. The remaining operators inside the building froze in complete terror beneath flashing red backup lights, while static hissed through the air like distant rain. Then, one by one, the emergency phones began answering themselves. Calm dispatch voices responded through empty receivers across the room. "Units are being dispatched. Please remain calm. Stay indoors." The dispatcher felt paralyzed listening to the impossible conversations surrounding him. Some of the voices sounded human. Others carried something deeply wrong beneath their tone, emotionless and unnaturally patient, like recordings imitating real people. Howard immediately started shutting down communication terminals manually, ripping cables from switchboards while shouting for everyone still inside the center to evacuate. But every disconnected system continued functioning anyway. Dead monitors flickered with incoming emergency alerts from cities already destroyed days earlier. Call timers counted upward on abandoned screens despite no active connections remaining. Somewhere beyond the darkened windows outside, distant explosions rolled through the collapsing city, while sirens wailed faintly beneath drifting smoke. Yet inside the emergency center, all attention remained fixed on the phones. Daniel's breathing still echoed weakly through the dispatcher's headset beneath the endless voices. "They're standing outside the dispatch room now," he whispered shakily. The dispatcher forced himself to focus. "Daniel, listen carefully. Find an exit and get out of those tunnels now." Silence followed. Then Daniel laughed weakly under his breath. Not amusement, hopelessness. "I don't think the tunnels let people leave anymore." A metallic groan echoed behind him through the underground darkness, followed by slow footsteps approaching across flooded floors. "They keep changing the paths." The dispatcher gripped the receiver harder. "Who's changing them?" Another voice answered, instead of Daniel this time, calm female. Clear enough to send ice through the dispatcher's chest. "Please hold while your call is transferred." The line erupted briefly with static before Daniel returned, sounding terrified now. They opened the lower doors. Howard overheard instantly and turned pale. "Lower doors," he whispered. Daniel's breathing became frantic. "There's something beneath the dispatch halls." A loud mechanical sound echoed behind him. Massive metal structures moving somewhere underground. Huge relay chambers, bigger than the city tunnels. The dispatcher quickly typed notes despite his shaking hands. "What's down there?" Several seconds passed before Daniel answered quietly. "Phones." The dispatcher frowned in confusion. "What? Thousands of them?" Daniel's voice trembled harder with every word. "Old emergency lines stretching farther underground than I can see." The dispatcher heard it faintly then. Endless ringing echoing through enormous underground spaces somewhere below Grayford City. "Not dozens of phones, thousands. The operators keep bringing calls downstairs," Daniel whispered. "Calls from everywhere." Howard suddenly grabbed old infrastructure maps from a nearby cabinet while scanning them desperately beneath flickering emergency lights. Then his expression completely changed. "No," he muttered. The dispatcher looked toward him immediately. Howard pointed shakily toward faded government schematics connected beneath Grayford's underground relay systems. "These tunnels don't stop at the city," he swallowed hard. "They connect to national emergency networks across the country." The dispatcher felt genuine panic rising inside him now. "You're saying all emergency systems are linked underground?" Howard slowly nodded. "Old Cold War communication grids." He looked toward the phones around them with horror. If whatever's underground reached the relay cores. Suddenly every monitor inside the emergency center flashed white simultaneously. Emergency alarms screamed across the room while incoming calls flooded every active line at once. Thousands of emergency requests overloaded the system instantly. Entire screens filled with corrupted location data from cities nationwide. Some districts listed no surviving populations. Others no longer existed at all. Yet the calls kept pouring in anyway. One nearby operator accidentally answered a ringing line during the chaos. Her terrified expression slowly faded as she listened silently to the voice on the other end. Then she calmly stood from her desk and walked toward the dark stairwell leading into the building basement without speaking. The dispatcher shouted after her, but she never reacted. Howard grabbed his arm immediately. "Don't follow anyone downstairs." Then Daniel screamed through the headset. The sound ripped violently across the communication floor, loud enough for nearby operators to hear through the receiver. Metal slammed somewhere underground, followed by frantic running footsteps echoing through tunnels. "They found me," Daniel gasped. The dispatcher stood instantly. "Daniel!" Behind the terrified breathing came another sound now. Calm dispatch operators speaking in unison somewhere close behind him underground. "Emergency services are available below. Please proceed to the lower levels. Your line remains active." Daniel sounded like he was crying now from exhaustion and fear. "They keep answering calls from the dead." Then suddenly, another voice spoke directly beside him through the line. Not distorted, not hidden beneath static, clear, male, emotionless. "Difja 417. The dispatcher froze completely. "Your transfer request has been approved." At that exact moment, every phone inside the emergency center stopped ringing. Total silence swallowed the room beneath flashing red emergency lights. Howard slowly backed away from the dispatch terminals in visible terror. Then the basement door near the far side of the communication floor creaked open by itself. Cold air drifted upward from the darkness below, carrying faint sounds of distant ringing phones echoing somewhere deep beneath the building. Several operators stared toward the open doorway hypnotically. One started walking toward it immediately before Howard physically stopped him. "Nobody goes downstairs," Howard shouted desperately. But the dispatcher barely heard him, because Daniel had started whispering again through the receiver. Softer now, almost calm. "I can see the main relay." The dispatcher swallowed hard. "What relay?" Daniel answered weakly. "The thing transmitting the voices." Static swallowed part of the line before he continued. "It's not equipment." The dispatcher's pulse hammered violently. "What do you mean?" Silence followed several seconds. Then Daniel whispered the final thing the dispatcher ever heard from him. "It's listening back." The line immediately died afterward. At the same moment, every monitor inside the emergency center suddenly switched to a single emergency broadcast screen, displaying only one sentence in bright white letters across black backgrounds. "Stay on the line." Then from deep below the building, Thousands of phones began ringing at once beneath the floor. The sound of thousands of phones ringing beneath the emergency center shook the entire building like an underground alarm system, waking after decades of silence. Every operator still remaining on the communication floor froze beneath the flashing red emergency lights, while the ringing echoed upward through walls, vents, and metal support beams from somewhere deep below the basement levels. It didn't sound distant anymore, it sounded close, directly underneath them. The dispatcher stared toward the open basement stairwell across the darkened room, while cold air drifted upward, carrying faint static and overlapping voices through the shadows below. Some of the voices sounded like emergency operators calmly answering calls. Others whispered things too distorted to understand clearly. Yet one detail terrified everyone most. The ringing beneath the building was spreading. More phones joined every few seconds until the noise became almost unbearable, like entire underground cities activating beneath the dispatch center at once. Howard immediately grabbed emergency shutdown keys from the relay cabinet and shouted for evacuation. "Everyone out now," he yelled, while operators scrambled toward the exits in panic. But several employees didn't move. They stood motionless near their desks, staring toward the basement stairwell with blank, exhausted expressions. One woman slowly removed her headset before whispering softly, "They're still waiting for someone to answer." Then she calmly started walking toward the darkness downstairs. Howard rushed after her and physically pulled her back before she disappeared into the stairwell shadows. The woman fought weakly against him while tears rolled down her face. "My husband's calling from below," she whispered desperately. "He says he's trapped." The dispatcher looked away immediately because he understood now. The voices underground weren't random hallucinations. They were using familiar people, familiar memories. The same thing Daniel described happening in the tunnels beneath Grayford City. Suddenly, every monitor across the emergency center flickered violently again. The emergency broadcast message vanished. In its place appeared hundreds of incoming calls flooding the national network simultaneously. Cities across the country, dead districts, evacuated zones, areas already destroyed during the outbreak. Yet the system kept routing emergency calls through them anyway. Howard stared at the screens in horror. The underground relay grids are reconnecting themselves. The dispatcher grabbed his headset again, desperately trying to reconnect Daniel's line, but only static answered. Then, buried beneath the interference, another voice emerged, calm male, unfamiliar. "Dice to 417. The dispatcher froze instantly. "Your assistance is required below." He nearly tore the headset off after hearing it. But the voice continued calmly through the static. "Emergency services cannot function without operators." Around the room, disconnected phones slowly lifted from their cradles again by themselves. Some swung gently in the air while others rested upright against empty desks, as though invisible dispatchers still held them. Then every receiver began playing emergency calls simultaneously. Thousands of terrified voices flooded the room at once. People screaming for help, children crying, sirens, gunfire, entire cities collapsing through the speakers. The dispatcher realized with horror that many calls sounded old. Some dated back to the very first outbreak nights. Others sounded far older than that. Howard suddenly shouted from across the communication floor while opening emergency infrastructure files on one surviving monitor. These relay systems were never just communication networks. The dispatcher hurried toward him while the calls echoed around them. Howard pointed toward classified documents connected to underground national emergency bunkers built during the Cold War. The government designed underground dispatch systems to continue operating after nuclear attacks. He scrolled through faded files rapidly. Automated relay centers, underground operators, emergency frequency amplifiers. Then Howard stopped scrolling completely. His face lost all remaining color. "Oh no." The dispatcher looked at the screen. One classified report contained repeated warnings highlighted across multiple pages. Extended exposure to deep relay frequencies causes auditory suggestibility during fatigue states. Another sentence beneath it froze the dispatcher completely. Subjects report hearing responses through inactive communication lines prior to psychological collapse. Howard whispered shakily. The outbreak didn't infect the relay systems. He slowly looked toward the basement stairwell, where the ringing phones continued below. The relay systems helped spread it. Suddenly the lights inside the emergency center failed completely. Darkness swallowed the room except for the pale glow of emergency monitors and dozens of disconnected phone screens, illuminating abandoned desks across the floor. Then the voices downstairs stopped ringing all at once. Absolute silence filled the building. Nobody moved, nobody breathed loudly. And from somewhere deep below the basement levels, footsteps began slowly climbing upward. Calm, measured, human footsteps echoing through the stairwell darkness. One operator near the exit started crying quietly. Another whispered prayers beneath his breath. The dispatcher stared toward the stairwell while Howard locked every emergency door he could reach. The footsteps kept climbing steadily. Then more footsteps joined them. Dozens now. Maybe hundreds ascending slowly beneath the building. The dispatcher suddenly noticed something moving across the monitors. Incoming calls were still connecting automatically even without operators. But now every call displayed the same location source, lower relay network. One of the phones near the dispatcher suddenly rang alone, sharp, loud, waiting. Nobody moved toward it. The ringing continued calmly through the silent emergency center. Then Howard whispered, "Don't answer it." The dispatcher nodded slowly. But after several seconds, the ringing stopped by itself anyway. Silence returned briefly. Then every phone in the room activated simultaneously, not ringing, speaking. Hundreds of calm dispatch voices echoed together through the darkness. "Emergency services have arrived." The basement stairwell door slowly opened wider at the exact same moment. Cold air flooded upward, carrying faint static and the smell of wet concrete from the lower levels. Shapes became visible standing motionless within the darkness below, human silhouettes. Operators wearing old dispatch headsets. Pale faces illuminated faintly by flashing lights deep underground. None moved aggressively. They simply waited silently at the bottom of the stairs, holding disconnected receivers against their ears. Then one of them slowly spoke using a voice identical to Daniel's. "The lines are open now." Panic exploded across the communication floor immediately afterward. Operators rushed toward exits while Howard overloaded the relay terminals manually, causing sparks and electrical fires to erupt across several switchboards. Monitors exploded into static one by one, while emergency alarms screamed throughout the building. The dispatcher grabbed Howard as both men fled toward the upper stairwells, while smoke filled the communication center behind them. But as they escaped, the dispatcher looked back one final time toward the basement entrance. The figures below hadn't moved. Hundreds of underground operators simply stood silently beneath the building, listening through disconnected phones, while emergency calls echoed endlessly through the darkness around them. Hours later, sunrise revealed most of the city abandoned. Fires burned across empty streets while military evacuation convoys disappeared toward distant highways beyond the skyline. The emergency dispatch center itself remained sealed behind quarantine barriers after electrical fires destroyed much of the communication floors overnight. Official reports blamed equipment overloads caused by system failures during the outbreak collapse. Nobody mentioned the underground relay networks. Nobody mentioned the voices. But late that evening, while hiding inside an evacuation shelter miles outside the city, the dispatcher heard a nearby emergency radio crackle softly through static beside sleeping survivors. Then a calm, familiar voice whispered through the speaker one final time. "Difcha 417. The dispatcher slowly looked toward the radio in horror. "Your shift is not over." Then, somewhere deep underground, beneath countless silent cities across the country, emergency phones began ringing again.